I'm the Rose Garden horticulturist. I've been on the job for almost 1 year now, and a lot has changed in the past year. So we're really hitting a exciting new evolution of the Rose Garden. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and we'll talk about some of the changes that have happened. And after we talk about the renovation, we're gonna look at some of the lovely roses because you can't talk about the Rose Garden without talking about the gorgeous roses that we'll see. So a big question I get is why do a renovation? A lot of folks stop by and they stop by every year to visit the Rose Garden. This is a wonderful trip that you can come in and visit and see the garden blooming. But what they don't see is often the everyday care or the everyday issues that we are facing in the Rose Garden. So really the big two reasons that we were doing the renovation is going to be because of disease issues. Um, Primarily Botryosphaeria, which is one of our more brand new fungus that we've been battling, as well as age. So we always deal with fungus in the rose garden. Roses are notorious for black spot and other fungal diseases, especially that have to do with their leaves. But in the past 3 or so years, a newer fungus called Botryosphaeria was producing this cane dieback. So if you see here, it turns a blackish brown, kind of where that spore in that fungus would enter at a fresh cut or a break. And as it travels down, it causes necrosis, which is literally dying tissue. So you can see it turns blackish brown, then to yellow. That's where we know that that tissue is being infected. And then it goes into healthy cane. So it progressively kills back tissue. And once it hits, we call the base of the rose bush the crown. Once it hits the crown, that bush is truly done for. You can never, there is no spray program, nothing you can really do to salvage that bush. So we were seeing a wide array of bushes that had different breaks or different cuts that were being infected, as well as a lot of the bushes were just older bushes. So the last full replanting of the rose garden was done in 2004. So some of our bushes were 16 years old, which for a rose bush in Florida is fairly impressive, especially considering all of the disease, fungus issues they would be facing. So on this one, you can actually see that the crown or that base of the rose bush was physically decaying. So we had bushes that were falling over or breaking because they couldn't hold themselves up anymore. And that also acts as an open wound. So if you have a decaying crown and bark is peeling away, that's like having a big wound on you. Bacteria, fungus, all sorts of not great stuff can get in there and really hinder the performance of that rose bush. So those were our two big reasons for going forward with a bigger renovation than we had done in the past. So as a quick overview of some of the disease issues we face in the rose garden, a lot of them are going to be leaf issues. So we'll have the classic black spot. That one you can see right here. It kind of looks like you were printing something out and started running out of ink. So it has kind of a splotchiness to the edges. Another one is Cercospora. This one is actually kind of on the uptick in the garden. We're keeping an eye out for it. It has more of a defined circular shape to it versus this, which is a bit more fading. So this is more of a circle, and it is a dark maroon to purple and has a white dot in the center. So those are both fungus, but they're in different genus. The Botryosphaeria dieback that we talked about, this is a sample that we sent to a lab to be positively identified. Again, you can see that browning of the cane turning into yellow. Rhizoctonia, another fungus, that one is primarily the root, the crown, and stem rot. And then anthracnose. Anthracnose is another leaf spot issue, and it looks very similar to black spot when it appears on the leaves. So we're dealing with a whole host of other organisms in the rose garden. A lot of people think it's just roses in there, No, we have weeds that pop up, but we also have some really fun disease issues to manage. So what did we change? A big thing of what we were doing was getting new rose bushes, but not just any new rose bushes. We really wanted to focus on what types of roses do best in Florida and in this environment. It is a very unforgiving environment. It's very moist, it's very hot, and those are two things that roses typically don't love. So by doing research and looking into different sources, we were actually able to narrow down some of our choices of roses that will hopefully do better in the garden. So one of my favorite things that we found along our journey of research was this book right here called Roses Without Chemicals. And I actually have my copy with me right now. So this was actually culminated research by Peter E. Kukielski, who is a phenomenal rosarian. And he actually went through and rated a bunch of different varieties of roses by disease resistance, their flowering, as well as their fragrance. And he also broke it up into regions. So he has the South region, Northwest region. So by doing that, our climate down in South Florida is not going to be the climate of, what people in Ohio need roses for. So this was very helpful to help narrow down what's going to do well. And we use some other sources as well. Aggie Horticulture's Earth Kind Roses. They've been doing it for a bit longer than Peter Kukielski's research has gone. So that was a great starting point, whereas Peter E. Kukielski in his book kind of took that research as well as research from other places. So the book is a great source of, different research from different organizations. Earthkind Roses was kind of the forefront for Southern roses. They're based out of Texas. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of rose growers in Florida who, put in that research and have that track history since this is through a university. But Texas is about as close to Florida as you can get in climate. So that was really beneficial. And also our UF IFAS extension. So through looking online, I did find a resource for people in Florida who wanted to grow roses, and it was done by local extension agents. And they talk about integrated pest management in different ways to help extend the life of your rose. So those were three sources that we have used currently, but I'm also really looking forward to reaching out to some other rose growers. There's actually a Rose Society in Honolulu, Hawaii. So kind of similar to our climate, a little bit more monsoon, but I'm really interested in reaching out to them, reaching out to other folks in the South, and seeing just what has worked well for them. So that's something I'm looking forward to doing in the future. There's also American Rose Trials for Sustainability. This is a project that Peter E. Kukielski also is working on, and they are looking at, roses that, again, no chemicals, what their natural resistance is. And then there's also ARS Deep South District. So the American Rose Society is an amazing resource if you want to learn more about roses. And they have different districts based on your climate. And talking about integrated pest management, this is something that we've been doing in the garden for 7 years now. And this is something you can do in your own backyard. So integrated pest management is really about identifying disease and pest issues before they become a massive problem and before you really want to go with that nuclear option. So our idea in the rose garden is always to identify what issues are occurring and how we can manage them and how we can manage them in a sustainable way. We want to understand that, we cannot have a fully perfect rose bush. As much as I would love that, as much as that is my ideal, in the climate we're in, we're always going to have a little bit of black spot or, flower thrip. So we're going to have a little bit of browning on the flower due to these tiny little insects. So we're also looking at how much aesthetic damage can we manage and can we live with. So by using integrated pest management, we can actually track our garden throughout the months and see how bad the black spot is, flower thrip is, and other disease and pest issues. and see what type of management we need to be doing. So this is an example of our integrated pest management worksheet. And I go through the garden and I do this on about a weekly basis. And I rate each bush and I take a good long look at it and try to evaluate how well it's doing. The other great thing about this is it also helps tell us what cultivars are doing best. So I've been throwing that word around a little bit, cultivar. It just means cultivated variety. So roses are within the same genus of Rosaceae and, or was it Rosa? One of the two, but they're all within the same genus, but they can interbreed with one another. And that's why we have hybrid teas and so many different types of roses. So different cultivars will have different climates in which they do best. When we were first looking at what cultivars we wanted to replant in the garden, I actually went through and taking those recommendation lists. We already had some of those roses in the garden, so I went through and I checked out who was doing best, what issues they were having. And I was very impressed to see that almost every single cultivar that was recommended was going above and beyond in a garden that was seeing a lot of decline. So by using this integrated pest management, we can also track what cultivar is doing the best. And we can assign numbers to that. We can have data for that. And we can track it throughout the months and years. So I know that late July, we're going to expect a whole lot of black spot to be defoliating our bushes. So going into each season, knowing what to expect, knowing how we want to try and manage that and get ahead of the curve. Another thing that's changed, when you walk into the garden, you might notice it looks a little less like a wall of roses. We've actually switched from this old way of planting, which is more a back to back. So back and forth, kind of a double row. And the new way we're going is more of a zigzag pattern. And this is to increase aeration between bushes. Because something we were noticing was as these bushes were getting bigger, they were actually starting to touch one another. Branches would go and cross and touch one another. And that actually helps facilitate the passing of disease and fungus. So we wanted to be able to spread out these bushes, make sure they weren't competing for resources or, contributing to the decline of one another's health. If there was a diseased bush next to a healthy bush, we didn't want to take down that healthy bush. So we've increased that planting distance. And another positive thing about this is if you look at one of these bushes that you would see in the middle of a row, you'd probably be able to see upwards of 50% of the bush. But in the new planting style, you're going to be able to see a lot more of that bush, closer to 75%. So it's for viewing pleasure, but it also has a function to it. And that is to keep the rose bushes nice and healthy. And if you have questions at any point during this, feel free to put it in the chat. One of us will look at it and I'll answer it as we go. So a big thing when you have fungus, what's really going to facilitate fungus is going to be water. Florida is a very humid place, perfect for fungus, not perfect for roses. So we've actually switched over our irrigation system. Our old irrigation system was pretty much what you would see in a typical lawn. It'd be a pop-up sprinkler and it would just, spray everywhere 360. And that created kind of a mist that would go into the air. It would settle on leaves and it would pick up, fungal spores, anything that was going on. It would settle on the leaves. As that dried, it would actually, leave the fungus on the leaves. And so something we've switched to instead is actually called a shrubler system. It's a very cute name. It's a shrubler. And so it's these little things you stick in the ground, and it is only watering the root zone. And so we're increasing our efficiency of where our water is going, and we're also decreasing how much water is getting on those leaves. And so our thinking in that is it's going to really help decrease that leaf spot issue since we're not getting those leaves wet. I will say a drawback to this is that we do have small mammals on the ground. That is awesome, contributing to a healthy ecosystem. but sometimes they want a sip. And so we have been dealing with a couple of chewed lines, but overall, I've really been loving this system. It is super easy to manage, and it is much more efficient in terms of water usage. So to give you an example of how we put this irrigation system together, we have one long line that runs the length of the bed, and it'll attach to an old sprinkler system, the old pop-up sprinkler system, either in the middle of the bed or one of the ends. And then we'll take, it's called spaghetti tubing, and we'll pop it into the larger tube, and then we'll have the shrubler head, and we can actually move that in different places around the bush. And we can open it up by moving this little head. You can open it up so that if you have a bush that wants more water, we actually have a rose called the swamp rose, and it is native to Florida. Uh, when I had it on a smaller setting, I noticed it was, defoliating, it was yellowing. So I opened that up and gave it more water, something pretty unusual, but for a native Florida rose, it's used to being very moist. So that gives us great control over what each individual bush wants. And again, this is a very easy system to use. Irrigation checks, I used to walk out, and by the end of it, I would be, needing to change shirts, needing to change socks. This one, I could run it every single day, and I would never get wet. And so that's really awesome. And we're also increasing, again, that efficiency.
Hey, Kai, we have a question from Donna. Donna would like to know if the irrigation water is reclaimed.
It is reclaimed water. So since it is reclaimed, it does deal with a fluctuating salinity, fluctuating nutrients. We do test it every once in a while to make sure it's not an issue, but it is reclaimed water from the county. Sweet. And also talking about water, water is a huge thing when you're dealing with roses. We were also dealing with some drainage issues. So when we were replanting new roses, we wanted to make sure that our beds were draining well after years and years of, rainstorms and the likes. It had gotten really packed down and hard. So we went through the beds and we actually took a tiller. So that first top 2 feet, we tilled up, and we also added something called perlite. And perlite is a mineral that is naturally occurring. It's akin to glass, and it helps increase water absorption and keeps things from getting too packed down. And so that's something we did to all of the beds that were replanted. And something that is not pictured, I wish I had gotten pictures of it, but every once in a while, when the summer rains got really bad, there's an area in the garden where it's backed up next to a banyan tree, and there's lovely ferns around it. It's very picturesque. But an issue we were having is that those ferns and those banyan roots were actually acting like a dam. So when a bunch of rain came down, it would stop at that banyan and get backed up into the garden. So if you get to come and visit the rose garden, if you look in the northwest corner, you'll notice that some of the mini beds, the beds with our little mini roses that are in triangle beds, there's not so many of them left. And that's because a lot of them got flooded. So that was within my first month of being here. We had about 2 to 3 inches of rain sitting in the garden for a couple of days. So that is not something we want to have in a rose garden. Roses are very finicky about their water. So what we've been doing is we actually are digging a trench through those ferns to help increase water flowing out of the garden so that we don't have a standing water issue again. Mulch. Homeowners, use mulch. Mulch is phenomenal. I will talk it up all day. Mulch is phenomenal because it will also help with water retention. If you just have bare soil, when that hot Florida sun comes out, it's going to take up all that water. And also it acts kind of like a slow release fertilizer. So, you use organic material and it'll slowly break down. We switched over from a cedar mulch to a pine mulch. And I don't have phenomenal pictures of it, so my apologies on that front. But up here you can see the cedar mulch. It's a bit lighter, And the thing I wasn't in love with this mulch was it actually would clump. So it would form little clods, um, and it just didn't seem to be doing an effective job. I really love this pine fine mulch because it's a bit, again, finer than the last mulch. It doesn't clump, and it is going to act as a soil conditioner. So as this pine fine works its way down into the soil, it's going to hold more space. Dirt particles are very fine. They'll clump together very easily, pack together, but this mulch is going to make sure it retains air in the soil so that we don't have as much of that hard packed soil as we used to. And this is going to happen over and over again. We're going to reapply that mulch, especially around the base of the plant, so that root zone is protected, so that the water doesn't evaporate into the air. And as it works its way into the soil, it's going to break down and provide slow release nutrients. And also, I love the color contrast. Not to be vain, if it wasn't a pretty mulch, that would be okay. But I think this is a really lovely color contrast to our white shell. So I'm really loving the way that color is popping out.
Kai, we have another
Yeah.
question from Eunice.
Yeah.
And Eunice would like to know, how much perlite should you add to your beds? They're planting their rose garden and they haven't started any planting yet.
Okay. So in terms of perlite, it kind of is up to your preference. I don't plant directly in perlite, of course, but for those big beds that we saw, I'll go back. These big beds, we used about a bag and a half of perlite. I would say just mix it in until you see roughly 20 little beads per square inch. Again, it doesn't have to get too scientific. Just having any perlite will really improve your drainage.
Kai, would you mind taking another question or two, or do you want to hold?
Absolutely, yes.
Great.
I don't want to spoil the rose pictures yet.
Okay. This one is from Elizabeth Rose.
Mhm.
And the question is, when hand watering, do you recommend watering further out from the bushes to encourage roots to spread further?
Hmm. I would say that is a good idea. Of course, if you have a very young bush, you don't want to go too far out, but definitely soaking the soil around, as well as something that would be more within your typical root zone, will encourage it to branch out. I like to say you don't want to baby your roses too much. You want to make them fight a little bit, because if they're not doing too well, maybe that's not a cultivar that you want to plant again. And I think I might be a little cruel in that aspect. But again, when you're doing roses in Florida, it is heavily going to be based on your desires for that bush, as well as how much maintenance you want. So if you're doing hand watering, um, I would say on a really young bush, maybe you can start 6 inches out and do watering. Give it a little splash in the center just to make sure if it's not there yet and it hasn't kind of found the water, that it's not going to dry up. But it does not hurt to, you know, make sure the soil around it is nice and damp. So it knows that there's nutrients and water out there for it to find.
Okay, thanks, Kai. We have another question. It's from Cynthia.
Yeah.
And this question is, does pine fine acidified the soil? So in Maine, she
Okay.
has acid clay soil.
So I'm not sure if the bark is acidic. I know for sure that the pine needles, if you want to slightly acidify the soil, pine needles are perfect for that. When it comes to pine bark, I'm not sure if it does the same thing. Um, but if you do want to do a slight acidic soil, you can also mulch with pine needles is another option.
Okay, those are all of our questions for the moment. Thank you,
Okay.
Kai. Thank you.
So we did a quick run through of the garden. And now I just want to introduce some of our new cultivars, but also new bushes. So some we've replanted. So the whole point of a rose garden is to be beautiful. I want to share a little bit of that beauty with you today. It's a
Mm.
little rainy out where I am today, but in these pictures, it's a wonderful sunny day in the garden. So to start off with, This was actually more of an experimental rose we planted. Um, when I was originally choosing what we were going to plant, I told myself, we're sticking to what we know. We know, X, Y, and Z works well. And then I stumbled across Fruticollo. And she said to me, she's like, aren't I beautiful? And I'm like, yes, but I haven't tried you yet. She's like, but you can. Um, so this was one of our new bushes, completely new, had never tried it before. And it was only released in 2018. And it was just so stunning that I had to give it a try. It is marketed as disease resistant, and she is doing fairly well right now. So I'm very happy we tried her out. Um, she doesn't have too much of a scent, but what really gets you is that gorgeous striping on those petals. It's very unique. It's very eye-catching. So even though we are going for tried and true, that doesn't mean we're not going to have, new varieties or new to us varieties. Um, we're going to try, I would say, about one each planting season. Our main goal is to keep the garden nice and healthy, but that doesn't mean that we can't see who else works out. So this one has been a real favorite of mine. She's always a treat to see blooming. Arctic Blue. So a funny story about this one is I actually did planting designs on the inner garden. So the designs are mirrored. I'm gonna go back real quick just to extrapolate. So I actually did a mirrored design where I would do, let's say, red here and red here. So red on the outside. Next on the inside would be pink, and then a pink, then yellow, yellow, and then white. So it has a mirrored look to it. When I was originally doing my plan, I did not choose Arctic Blue. I had someone else in mind for that spot, but that fell through. I couldn't find it at the vendor. And so I decided to give her a try. We had previously had a bush and it had gone under, so I wasn't actually sure if she performed that well. And she has impressed me so much. This is one of our fastest growing bushes. She does have a little bit of an issue with black spot, but no more than anyone else. Um, yeah, she's just gorgeous. She's this vibrant Barbie pink. This one has been a very impressive bush that I'm glad we kind of lucked into her. She wasn't my original plan, but she really came through. She is actually about, and it depends on which bush, but one of them is almost 4 feet tall now. And that's after just being planted in either December or January. So over the course of 6 months or less, this bush has really put on a lot of growth. Speaking of a lot of growth, if I had to choose an MVP, it would have to be this one. Dutcher, she's a white flower, a little bit of a scent, nothing that really comes out and speaks to you, but it is a light scent. But some of them are enormous. Like every day I walk in there and I feel like she's put on another 2 growth. And all over the bush, if you can see it, uh, most rose bushes, when they're putting out new growth, it's a purpley red color at the ends. So you can see some new growth right there, new growth right there, and just all over the bush. She is just filled with flowers, filled with leaves, little to no leaf spot issues, no black spot, no cercospora. Um, if anyone is looking for a low maintenance rose bush, this would be the one I would advertise to you. She has just been performing great. And we are going into summer season, which is going to be the real test of strength for our rose bushes. But I'm betting on her. She's been really amazing. She just looks like someone stuck pom-poms all over her. So she's uh, very vibrant. Going on to a named rose, a neat thing about roses with people's names is you actually have to get permission from either that person or their family. So this one was named after Julia Child. And I need someone to double check this for me, but to me, this one smells like licorice. So I don't know if that's just me, but it has this licoricey smell to it. It's very unique. And I love the buttery yellow. You always know when she is in the garden. This is a phenomenal rose. And she is also fairly disease resistant, as are most of our roses. But again, that flower is just show stopping. Pearl Door. So this was actually one that was requested by a volunteer. And, in my research, it also said that she was an earth kind rose, was disease resistant. So we planted her again, and she's been doing really well. What I love about her is this apricot coloring. So she has a peachish apricot to her, and then she fades out into a pinkish white. And her her petals actually curl underneath, so you can see it curls under, and it creates this very whimsical look. She's definitely not your typical, when you think of a rose, you're going to think of a high centered rose, which has, tight petals in the middle and maybe is about this open. But what I'm really loving about the garden in this stage of its life is that you can see that there is no one way to look like a rose. You see so much diversity in color, scent, even the leaves. You wouldn't think, you're like, all the leaves look the same. All leaves are the same. You can really tell the difference in how skinny they are, the color of the leaves, and also the form of the rose. I actually have people come up to me and they're like, "Are you sure you only have roses planted in here?" I'm like, "I'm pretty sure. I think so." Um, but I love seeing people's reaction to having their mind opened up to how different roses can look. And so she's a very whimsical one. And to pull up, if you see the signs here, I get a lot of questions. What do they mean? And I kind of translate it into a larger version up here. The first line is going to be the name. That's the official name of that cultivar, that genetic strain. The type, the type of rose, Polyantha actually means like many flowered. Other types are floribunda, which translates to like large rose, or grandiflora, large rose. So the types, I am by no means an expert in yet. There's tens of them, but that's kind of the class that they're considered under. And that primarily has to do with the form of the rose. Is it high centered? Is it cupped? Uh, how many petals it has? And then the year. This is my number one question that I get, aside from when are the roses blooming. And the year is the year it was cultivated. Some people are very impressed. They're like, "You have a rose here that is 150 years old." And I'm like, I wish. I wish our roses lived that long. Um, but the year just indicates when that particular strain or that particular genetic type was created. Um, so the one that was created in 1875 is essentially genetically identical to the one we have today. There might be minor variations, but ultimately the way that you cultivate roses and the way that you have multiple bushes of the same type is you will actually snip the rose. So say this flower kind of loses its petals, it has gone through its life cycle. You would go all the way down where you see this 5 leaf, and you would take a little snip, and then you would try and root it. So you could use a rooting hormone. Um, some plants will take in just water. You put them in water and they'll form roots. But that is the way that you create a new rose bush. Um, Unless you want to, create your very own cultivar, you typically don't do them from seeds, because that could be any type of rose hybridized. So if you have a rose you like, you're licensed to cultivate it. That's the way you do it, is by actually snipping off a branch and rooting it to create a new rose bush. So plants are really cool that way. Who can say, I dropped this piece of my hair and there's another me? Um, but essentially, that's what some plants can do. So this is an example of a rose that has so much history behind it. So a little bit of backstory on this rose. It was actually cultivated on the eve of World War II, and the cultivator sent it different cuttings to, I think, 3 or 4 different countries, because he was hoping it would survive the war, because he wasn't sure if he would have to evacuate. He was in France. So he's hoping that this bush in particular would be able to survive. And it did. And at the end of World War II, um, they had different names in each country that they were sent to, but the American name was the Peace Rose. And so it was actually unveiled at the end of World War II. And every member of the United Nations was given a peace rose with a message of peace, a message for world peace, which is a really beautiful sentiment. It has a lovely scent. Uh, and this is one of the roses where it actually changes colors as the flower goes through its life cycle. It starts out very yellow, and then it has these light pink tips at the end of the petals. So this is a historical rose. Um, she is a little so-so, I would say, as far as performance goes. She is a little more susceptible to black spot. Again, Florida is not a place to grow for everyone, but we do keep her because she has a lot of significance, and she is a huge fan favorite. Sun Rosa Orange Delight. So the type on this one is a little off. It's also known as a dwarf shrub. So a type of rose is a shrub, and this is a very compact rose. If you're looking to container garden or only have a little bit of space, she is really phenomenal. There's another one. Let's see if I didn't mention, but in the same line, there is a rose called Sun Rosa Fragrant Pink. And if you're looking for a rose with fragrance, that's the one you want to go to. This one doesn't have fragrance, but she's really amazing because she has all the colors of the sunset. Really a lovely flower. Right now, they're actually shedding, uh, kind of like a cat, I guess you could say. But they've been sucking up all the nutrients from their old leaves and letting those old leaves drop, and then taking all that nutrients and putting it into new growth. So occasionally I'll walk into the garden and I'm like, oh no, what's wrong? But they're just going through that cycle of pushing out new growth and letting go of old growth. Belinda's Dream is another fan favorite, and it's very easy to see why. Um, these blossoms, once they get to their full age, to their full size, they're roughly the size of a fist. So these are very big, very flashy flowers, lovely sweet scent. And I just love, particularly in this picture, you can see it going from, a small bloom. It's starting to open up a bit more. It has that really geometric look to it, to the full look. So we have quite a few of these in the garden, um, and I'm very happy with her. So she's been here a while. Hot cocoa. We used to have a gigantic bush of this one. I remember when I first came on, it was about 6 feet to 7 feet tall, huge bush. Unfortunately, in the renovation, we had to make some sacrifices, and the full inner garden was renovated, as well as um, the row between the miniatures and the outer row. But we did replant her. We have about 3 new hot cocos, and they have a really lovely rusty red to them. So I love how different this is. You're used to the vibrant red, but this is a very nice rust colored rose. Dochassez de Bourbon, she is really neat because she has that cupped look to her. It almost looks like a wine cup. And she is also very sweet smelling. So rose scent is actually a recessive gene. So the more you hybridize roses together, the more you're going to lose that smell. So what I really love about some of the roses we're putting in our garden is either they're older roses that have that scent, or they're from hybridizers who are knowledgeable about, it being a recessive gene and are actually trying to breed scent back into roses. So we're really looking at disease resistance, but one of my favorite things is kids will come in from the Bolger play space and their first instinct is to go and sniff each rose. So one of my dreams is that, we have a lot of roses that are disease resistant, but also we're taking into account that classic, that beloved stop and smell the roses feeling. So she's one of my favorites to smell. Very light, fruity, sweet scent. Limoncello. This is another one that has really impressed me. Put on a lot of great growth. Not a whole lot of scent, which is a bit disappointing since we just talked about it. You would think she would smell like lemons. Not the case with this one, but she's a great variety. Grande Amore. We have 2 older bushes as well as 3 younger ones. The older bushes are again 6 to 7 feet tall, very impressive. There were some bushes I just did not have the heart to pull out when we were doing the renovation, and these ones are showing me why. They're very large, in charge, fairly resistant, and really awesome, vibrant red. So this is one of my favorites just for the sake of you look at red and it almost doesn't look real. It looks like you're looking at a Technicolor film. So this is a new fan favorite. She does have a scent, and she's actually a flat rose. So when we think about roses, we think about a lot of petals, cupped or high centered. She is a flat rose, and she has a very large, what we call a heart. So you see that wonderful yellow heart at the center. Within a week of planting her, people were coming up to me and asking for her name. Just very impressed with this one in particular. And the bees love her. She is very easy to go and pollinate. So whenever I have to trim her, I have to step back and let the bees have their taste first and um, have a nice agreement with them that we take turns. And then another fan favorite, Mr. Lincoln. Oh, do we have a question? No? Okay. Mr. Lincoln is very perfumey. Um, Again, this really lovely maroon dark red, not as vibrant as Grande Amore. She is more like acrylic paint if you went to the paint store. This one is very luxurious. And this picture is not actually her at her full size. So she does look a bit more like a high center rose here. This is your classic kind of Valentine's Day rose look. But she has a lovely scent. And again, fan favorite. We replant her because we want to see if she does well, but also because even if, her foliage isn't the best, we know there are people who are going to be so happy to see her and so happy to smell her. So our renovations are always ongoing. We're looking at redoing the mini beds as well as this outer row where you kind of see those statues at, the row just in front of those statues. We have big plans coming. A lot of it is to be determined. We're figuring out, just like everyone else, our plans as we go through these times. But I very much hope that you get to visit the Rose Garden soon because I hope you'll be just as impressed with me with just how healthy so many of our young roses are. They've been very impressive, and I'm incredibly excited to share the Rose Garden with you. So before we sign off, does anyone have any questions, parting words?
Hi, it's Cindy from Maine, thinking about coming back next winter. Do you have any volunteers coming back to the garden soon with the whole coronavirus thing? I would think since it's outside and you should be able to maintain space, that would be one of the venues where maybe people can come back. Are you talking about that yet?
As of today, we've announced we will be reopening on the 27th to the public. But as of then, we are not having volunteers back just because we're still working on our safety protocols. We want to make sure everyone's safe as possible. Really, as soon as I know, you'll know. That is to be determined. But we are definitely looking at getting folks back in the safest way possible. So I'll keep you updated. I really miss all of you. So we'll see.
Kai, we had several questions come in over the chat. Eunice would like to know if you have any recommendations for climbing roses.
It's funny you mentioned that. I just had a talk with someone about climbing roses. We don't have too many in Mabel's Rose Garden right now, since they do require quite a bit of TLC just to make sure they climb properly and you get what you want out of them. But my number one recommendation would be Peggy Martin. So our Peggy Martin climbing rose uh, is pretty much world famous. It's another one of those classics. That cultivar actually survived Hurricane Katrina. She was under seawater for 20 feet of seawater for, I want to say, a week or two, and she survived. So that is very much a very hardy climbing rose. I would also recommend, again, not enough praise for this book. They do have a couple climbing varieties in there, but my number one would be Peggy Martin. I know she does well here.
Okay, a few more questions. Elizabeth Rose would like to know if you can give any advice for getting through summer fertilizing restrictions.
Oh, okay. Well, I first want to say I'm very happy that you know about the blackout dates. Um, Keeping that in mind, something we do in the garden, if your roses are mature enough, again, if you have young roses, you typically don't want to be hitting them with uh, chemical fertilizer because it can cause root burn, tip burn. A way to get through that if you have mature bushes is slow release fertilizer. It can be a bit pricier, but it will release nutrients little by little. So some are going to be 180 days uh, instead of hitting them all at once with, your typical chemical fertilizer. It's going to give it a little bit at a time instead of, a big feast for the rose where it's like, here's all your nutrients. It's going to be a little snack at a time. So check up again on blackout dates, what slow release fertilizer constitutes for that in your county. But slow release fertilizer is great, better for the environment than, just throwing liquid fertilizer on and potentially leaching through. Um, Also, and I would have to check if it counts in the blackout dates as well. Since we have young roses right now, we've been using a liquid fish fertilizer. So that's organic, it's not a chemical fertilizer. So it's fish emulsion, which is a byproduct of the fishing industry. And that has been really good for our young roses. So those would be my two suggestions. Look into slow release fertilizer and fish emulsion.
Okay, Kai Ann Madden would like to know if you can recommend the best rose for a beginner growing roses in zone 10A.
Oh, zone 10. Okay. I I will add a caveat. It depends on what you're willing to put into it. Like I was speaking to earlier with the Dutcher rose, I think that's phenomenal for someone who wants a very hands-off approach. You don't want to be babying it too much. You don't want to have to deal with pesticides. That's a great rose, but she can get big. So if you want something that's going to remain small and contained, you might want to go for a shrub rose. So um, depending on size and everything, I believe in zone 10, I would really stick to something like a Dutcher, um, probably an old garden roses, because if you get into like a hybrid teas are finicky, usually require a bit more love. So I would recommend see what types of old garden roses are recommended for your area.
Okay, and Kai, I'm guessing you cannot see the chat. So I'll just pass along.
Unfortunately.
You can. So I'll just pass along thanks, big thanks from Rick Davis, from Eunice and Cynthia. It was a beautiful and informative presentation and lots of helpful information. And you have an obvious love of roses.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad. It thrills me that there are rose gardeners in the area. Even if it's frustrating, every single failure is a lesson. And that's something I've learned on the job. So really keep at it and, don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. Do that research, do that background, look into stuff. And I really wish you the best of luck in your rose gardening experience because it is very rewarding.
Okay, that's it for the chat. That's all that's posted right now. So
Okay.
thank you very much, Kai. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me. It was a pleasure having all of you. Hope to see you in the garden soon.